The inheritance was supposed to be split. Then they claimed I wasn't real family. Turns out, they should have kept quiet. Rain gnawed at the windows of the Dunbridge estate like a dog at the bone, relentless and uninvited. The parlor smelled of aged leather, scorched wood, and the faintest trace of pipe tobacco, a scent that clung to the velvet curtains like a memory that refused to fade. The fire crackled, a hollow warmth in a room steeped in cold civility. They had all gathered, each in their designated place, their designer coats draped over antique armchairs, shoes polished enough to reflect the flicker of the flames. At the center of it all sat Mr. Howarth, the family's longtime solicitor, with a leather-bound folio resting across his knees like a sacred tome. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic tap of his spectacles against the rim of his coffee cup. Every gaze turned toward him with a hunger that betrayed the pretense of grief. They were dressed in mourning black, of course, but no one mourned in silence. Not really. Not when fortunes hung in the air like perfume. Not when Raymond Dunbridge, patriarch of a sprawling dynasty, had finally succumbed to the decay of time. I stood near the window, not quite among them, yet not outside either. A figure inconveniently in between. My reflection flickered in the glass, ghostly and quiet, just as I'd always been to them. I didn't belong to their bloodline, not by the genetics they clung to with such pride. But I had been there, at every hospital visit, through every stroke, during the long, lonely decline that made them all too squeamish to witness. I had held the old man's trembling hand when his eyes flicked toward the ceiling like he was already seeing some distant shore. Still, they looked through me now, as they always had. Except for Aunt Clara, who smirked with the venom of someone who'd practiced this moment in the mirror. "I suppose we'll finally have clarity," she said, her voice sugared over poison. Mr. Howarth cleared his throat and flipped open the folio. His hands were slow and deliberate, fingers brushing the pages like relics. "Raymond Dunbridge's final will and testament," he began, "was last updated 7 months prior to his death." Gasps were stifled with a grace that reeked of effort. That detail alone was ammunition. Everyone had assumed, expected, that the last will had been signed years ago, before his mind had begun its descent into shadows. "He made it quite clear," the solicitor continued, "that his estate, properties, business holdings, and personal effects are to be divided equally among his named beneficiaries." Murmurs of approval fluttered through the room, a chorus of greed barely cloaked in relief. Names began to spill forth. Clara, of course. Peter, the pompous cousin who wore his inheritance in the way he over-polished his speech. Evelyn, the daughter who hadn't visited in years, but somehow found her tears easily enough for the funeral. "And lastly," Mr. Howarth said, glancing toward me with a pause that sliced through the room like a cleaver through ripe fruit, "to Morgan Thorne, who Raymond Dunbridge referred to, in his own words, as the one who gave me back my dignity in dying. An equal share." Silence. That specific kind of silence, thick and charged, like the breath before a thunderclap. Clara was the first to speak, her voice brittle with rage poorly disguised as confusion. "I'm sorry, but Morgan isn't... They're not family." "She's not blood," Peter echoed, his voice already raised a pitch higher, his composure slipping like a badly fitted mask. "She was taken in. She was a charity case." Evelyn turned to her brother, eyes wide, as if hearing the will out loud had shattered some delicate equilibrium. "Dad wouldn't do that. He wouldn't..." "He did," I said finally, my voice steady and quiet, but loud enough to still the spiral of denial beginning to build. "You all just never asked why I stayed when you all left." "How dare you?" Clara began, standing now, the scrape of her chair loud and dramatic. "You don't get to insert yourself into this, into our family legacy." "You were never adopted," Peter snarled. "You were never his child. Just a housemaid's brat who overstayed her welcome." I didn't flinch. I didn't rise to the bait. Not this time. Mr. Howarth interjected with a raised hand, his voice firm, formal, and tinged with something close to frustration. "Ladies and gentlemen, regardless of your personal sentiments, the will is binding. Raymond Dunbridge was of sound mind when he revised it. I have the evaluations, statements from 2 licensed practitioners, and a video recording of the signing, should anyone require evidence." "Forgery," Clara spat. "Desperation," Evelyn said, clinging to the idea like a lifeline. "Actually," I said, reaching into my satchel and pulling out a slender envelope, yellowed with age but sealed with Raymond's personal insignia. There's more." Their eyes followed the envelope like wolves, scenting blood. Mr. Howarth took it with practiced care and slid a thin letter from its folds. As he read silently, his face shifted. First surprise, then solemn recognition. He cleared his throat again, this time almost with reverence. "This letter," he began, "is a private addendum. Not legally binding, but emotionally clarifying. It confirms in Raymond's handwriting that Morgan is not only his legal heir, but the child of his late brother, Samuel Dunbridge." It hit the room like a bolt from divine judgment. No one spoke, not even Clara. "Samuel had a child?" Evelyn whispered, her voice hollow. "Yes," I replied, my gaze unwavering. "He had me. He entrusted me to Raymond when he knew he was dying. The family didn't know because Raymond didn't want you to. He said you'd devour me before I ever had a chance." Peter's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His color drained like tea from a cracked glass. "He always said he had no siblings left," Clara stammered. "That Samuel died overseas. That he never had a child." I stepped forward now, each footfall as deliberate as the pounding in their temples. "No, he had an embarrassment. One that would have ruined your precious family image. So he hid it. But Raymond didn't. He raised me, taught me, and loved me. You called me a stray. He called me his second chance." They looked as if the room were closing in on them, walls bending inward beneath the weight of their own venom. "And now," I said, the fire flickering behind me like a crown of flame, "you'll treat me like you treated him at the end, like I'm invisible. But unlike him, I'm not dying." The storm outside thickened, wind howling as if echoing the chaos unraveling inside. Mr. Howarth leaned back in his chair, no longer a referee, merely a witness. Raymond instructed that his journals, correspondences, and personal recordings be made available upon contest, he added, sliding a second folder across the table. They contained compelling truths, family truths. The silence was no longer uncertain, it was dread, heavy and clawing, as the first real understanding settled like frost upon their spines. They had tried to erase me. But in doing so, they'd erased the very person who could have spared their dignity. And this was just the beginning. The estate had a silence that was never quiet, not truly. Beneath the high ceilings and oil portraits, beyond the echoing halls and dust-veiled chandeliers, there lingered a hum, a legacy of whispered arguments, muffled sobs, and the phantom shuffle of feet that had once walked with power. The Dunbridge name was carved into stone, etched in law, embroidered on silk-lined ledgers, and coffee-stained correspondence from men who'd once shaken the world in tailored suits. But under all that prestige, there was rot. It had always been there, hiding behind velvet drapes and neatly trimmed hedges, waiting to be disturbed. And I was the one who had begun to lift the veil. They scattered after the reading like startled deer, each pretending grace while their world split beneath them. Peter, who once spat numbers like scripture and had believed inheritance was a guarantee, vanished into his Maserati with hands trembling on the wheel. Evelyn disappeared to her suite, claiming a migraine, though anyone could guess she was tearing through old family files and calling her lawyer at double speed. Clara stayed behind. Of course she did. The eldest. The self-anointed keeper of the Dunbridge legacy. Her stare hadn't left me from the moment the letter was read, like a falcon circling, too proud to strike just yet. She approached while I stood by the conservatory's tall arched doors, watching the rain spill like ink down the glass. Her perfume hit first, violets and vinegar, a scent as artificial as her compassion had always been. "You've made your point," she said, each syllable clipped and brittle. "I haven't even begun," I replied, not turning. Let her stew in the knowledge that I could face away from her and still own the room she'd once ruled. "You think he raised you out of love?" she scoffed, stepping closer. "You were his guilt project, his atonement. Do you think I didn't know about Samuel? Of course I did. He was a drunk, a disgrace. Your existence was his final shame. Then why didn't you say anything at the reading?" I turned now, slowly. "Why not contest it if you knew?" Her lips thinned into a slash of disdain. "Because I didn't think Raymond would be stupid enough to give you a piece of what's ours. You weren't a threat. You were a footnote." "And now?" I asked, taking a step forward. "What am I now, Clara?" She didn't answer. Her silence was a crumbling wall, one I no longer needed to climb. I walked past her, feeling the heat of her glare on my back, like a candle struggling to catch fire in a storm. Upstairs, the hallway to Raymond's study stretched longer than it ever had when he was alive. Without his voice to greet me or his wheezing chuckle to fill the air, the corridor felt like a mausoleum. Still, I pushed the heavy door open and entered the sanctum no one else had dared to. They'd feared it, the clutter, the dust, the overwhelming sense of memory. But I had lived in this room. I had sat beside the fireplace as Raymond dictated letters I'd type out on the ancient Smith Corona. I had poured him tea from a cracked porcelain set and listened to his stories while moths thumped against the lampshades. This room was memory made solid. And now, it was power. I moved past the desk, knowing exactly where to look. Beneath the inkwell tray, behind the false panel on the right-hand bookshelf, I found the lockbox. The code was a date, one none of them would have guessed, the day I'd first called him uncle. I still remembered the look in his eyes, how it startled him, cracked something hardened by decades of silence. He'd never said it aloud, but he carried that word with reverence after that moment. He'd written it on his will. Now, it opened the safe. Inside were the rest of the letters, the ones that bled truth in long, aching strokes. Letters from Samuel, desperate and frightened. Confessions from Raymond, filled with shame and love and a desire to do right by the only family he had left. Photographs, some faded beyond recognition, others clear as yesterday. One of me, barely 5, asleep in Raymond's arms while the sun bled through the window behind us. Proof. And beneath it all, a journal, bound in soft leather, the color of dried blood. I took it, cradled it in my hands like scripture, and began to read. Raymond had documented everything. His guilt over what had happened to Samuel, the choices he made to keep the family image pristine, the quiet arrangements to hide my birth, the way he slowly shifted his assets in preparation for this day. He knew what the others would say. He knew how they would turn. He had been counting on it. This wasn't just an inheritance, it was a test. Let them show you who they really are, he had written in one entry. Then burn the masks they wore for your whole life. By the time I finished reading, the storm outside had waned into a whisper, as though the sky had run out of tears. I walked back downstairs with the journal in hand and stepped into the drawing room where Evelyn now sat, glass in hand, mascara streaking her cheeks. Her expression lifted the moment she saw the book. "You found something," she said, straightening. "I did." She stood. "Look, Morgan, about earlier. We were all just surprised, that's all. This is a lot to take in." I let her words hang in the air like spoiled meat. "You should sit back down," I said softly, "because this is going to get heavier." She blinked, confused. I opened the journal to a marked page and laid it on the coffee table in front of her. Clara appeared in the doorway seconds later, eyes sharp, jaw set. "What is this now?" she snapped. "The truth," I said, stepping back so they could both see. "Your father's truth, the one he wrote when none of you were around to hear it." Peter arrived not long after, pulled into the room by some familial sense of danger. He looked like hell, tie loosened, shirt stained with a splash of coffee. He barely glanced at the journal before muttering, "You think anyone outside this house is going to believe that? A handwritten book? You could have forged all of it." "I could have," I admitted, "but I didn't, and Raymond knew someone would say that too." From my satchel, I withdrew a second item, a small USB drive sealed in a labeled envelope. On it were video recordings Raymond had made over the past 2 years, dated, time-stamped, and notarized. In each, he spoke plainly, without hesitation, of his wishes, of his guilt, of the blood he owed me through Samuel, and the love he offered in its place. Their silence was no longer contempt. It was fear. "I've sent copies to Raymond's lawyer," I continued, "another to the press, one to each of the board members at Dunbridge Industries, and of course one to the historical foundation you so proudly sit on, Clara, the one that prides itself on bloodline purity and moral legacy." "You wouldn't," Clara breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I already did," I replied. Evelyn collapsed into the chair. Her hands trembled around her glass. Peter turned away, pacing, muttering under his breath. "I don't want everything," I said. "I want what's mine, what was promised, and now, what's owed." "You'll ruin this family," Clara spat. "No," I said, meeting her eyes with unshakable calm. You already did. I'm just lifting the shroud." In the silence that followed, there was no longer any doubt. They knew the tide had turned, not in their favor. Not this time, and I wasn't going anywhere. The first headline dropped on a Thursday morning, tucked in the finance section between a profile on foreign markets and a shallow exposé on old money debutantes. Most readers would have passed over it with no more than a glance, but those who knew the name Dunbridge paused. Their coffee cooled. Their silence deepened. Heir of secrets, Dunbridge patriarch leaves estate to hidden relative. That was the tame version. More vicious takes followed swiftly, penned by online gossip columns and broadcast through early morning talk shows, where polished anchors grinned like jackals behind velvet veneers of sympathy. They all wanted the same thing, blood from a broken dynasty. And Raymond had handed them a fountain. By noon, Evelyn's phone had exploded with calls from her art dealer, her board memberships, and her ex-husband's new wife, who suddenly remembered unpaid debts with terrifying precision. Clara had gone dark, shutting down her email, canceling her scheduled speaking engagement at the Museum of Historical Integrity, and instructing her assistants to direct all calls to voicemail. Peter, true to form, tried to sue. His legal motion came filed in a thick envelope of false confidence and expensive paper, stamped with the desperate boldness of someone used to having his tantrums codified into legal threats. It accused me of manipulating an ailing man, of crafting documents with deliberate deceit, of faking relation for personal gain. But Peter had never been meticulous. He was loud, certainly. Conniving, yes, but not careful. He assumed courts would bend for the Dunbridge name. He assumed the law would tremble beneath the weight of his lineage. What he didn't realize was that Raymond had anticipated every move and prepared countermeasures for each. Before the ink had dried on Peter's paperwork, Mr. Howarth had already filed a statement of defense backed by notarized videos, psychological evaluations, witness testimony, and even a secondary will locked in a trust account that activated upon any contestation of the first. Raymond, in death, was still playing chess, and Peter was stuck shouting over a checkmate he hadn't even seen coming. The estate became a fortress of tension in those weeks. Evelyn remained mostly in her room, alternating between long silences and bursts of performative outreach. She'd started posting old photos of Raymond on social media, captioned with sentimental lies about Sunday dinners and life lessons she'd never actually received. Her followers sent hearts and condolences, but the comments under each post turned colder by the hour. People knew, and Evelyn hated being known in ways she hadn't curated. Clara, meanwhile, treated the house as if it were a museum, walking from room to room with the bitterness of a deposed queen. She tried to summon her old allies, the family attorney she used to manipulate, the chairman of the Dunbridge Foundation who once called her a woman of incomparable moral fiber. They all declined to help. The board distanced itself from the scandal. Donations froze. A planned scholarship in Raymond's name was quietly withdrawn. "I built this family's image," she hissed one evening as we passed in the library, her fingers wrapped around a glass of scotch that trembled slightly with each step. "Every photograph, every donation, every headline. Do you think people wanted to believe in us? I made them believe." "You dressed the corpse," I said without slowing, "but you never cleaned the rot." She threw the glass. It shattered against the bookshelf behind me. I didn't flinch. She didn't speak to me for 3 days after that, but the message was clear. She wasn't just angry, she was unraveling. It wasn't just the press or the legal filings that tore at them. It was the slow and steady collapse of their own narrative. Raymond's journals had been published by an investigative reporter 2 weeks after the initial headlines. Not in full, but enough to send tremors through the family's curated facade. The public read about a man haunted by brotherly betrayal, about a child abandoned by fear, not fault, about a family too proud to acknowledge a wound, even as it festered into legacy. There were passages that shook even me, things Raymond had never told me in life. His letters to Samuel, confessing how he'd tried to pay off a doctor to falsify birth records. His admission that he'd once considered sending me away entirely, locking me behind a private boarding school wall where the name Dunbridge would never echo. He had feared what the family would do to me more than he feared losing me, and that fear, eventually, became love. It was complicated, painful, human. But it was mine now, as much as the estate, as much as the company shares, as much as the Dunbridge name, whether they liked it or not. By the 3rd week, things turned colder. The family began to splinter openly. Evelyn, once Clara's lapdog, began giving press statements of her own, soft interviews, tearful reflections, carefully curated remorse. She even tried to reach out to me, left a handwritten note at my door one morning, apologizing for the things she'd said during the will reading, offering a private reconciliation over lunch. I didn't respond. I left the note untouched for days, letting it curl and yellow at the edges as the world moved on without her. Peter, despite his legal defeat, continued to stir trouble. He leaked false information to online outlets, fabricated stories of abuse, of manipulation, claimed Raymond had been under the influence of drugs when he filmed the inheritance recordings. He paid for medical experts to question the video's authenticity, but it backfired, spectacularly. One of the experts turned out to be someone Raymond had supported through cancer treatment years before. He released a statement defending Raymond's clarity and emotional resolve, and publicly condemned Peter's smear campaign. The more they pushed, the more they exposed themselves. It wasn't just about losing the inheritance anymore. It was about legacy. And legacy was bleeding from every crack in their glass fortress. I stayed mostly silent. I didn't do interviews. I declined all offers for book deals or reality shows or branded memoirs. I let the truth speak, and it did. Loudly. I spent my days walking the estate grounds, tending to Raymond's rose garden, cataloging the library he'd curated over decades. I answered letters from people who'd once worked for him, people who remembered him not as a tycoon, but as a man who once paid their mortgage when no one else would. And at night, I read his journals, Samuel's letters, my own memories, written out in fresh ink, filling pages I kept locked in a drawer only I knew existed. Because this was far from over. Clara had one last move. I felt it every time she passed me in the halls with eyes like blades and breath that hissed like old gas lines. She had something buried, something darker. Maybe it was about Samuel, maybe about me, but she was waiting for the right moment, a final card to play. And I would be ready. Raymond taught me how to survive. Clara, Peter, Evelyn, they were teaching me how to win. Time moved differently inside the estate now. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer no longer echoed with regal rhythm, but dragged itself along, fatigued, as if the house itself had grown tired of the names that once ruled it. Dunbridge Manor was quieter these days, not just empty of people but hollow of illusion. The walls no longer wore their secrets proudly. They sagged beneath the weight of exposed truths, gutted of the silence that once kept them pristine. It had been 78 days since the reading of the will, since the firestorm, since the unraveling, and still they lingered, like ghosts too bitter to cross over. Clara stayed, though she didn't speak to anyone unless necessary. She had retreated to her wing of the house and lived there like a shadow pinned to wallpaper, moving only when no one was watching. She no longer held court in the drawing room, no longer sat upright in her power chair during breakfast, issuing her edicts with a smile. Her authority had become brittle, like porcelain left in a storm, beautiful only until it cracked. Peter had left weeks ago, slinking back to his penthouse in the city with the look of a man who'd finally realized that no amount of noise could fill the silence left by credibility. His lawsuit had died in court, publicly and loudly. The judge had reprimanded him for wasting time and resources. The press had published courtroom transcripts including the part where Peter called me a fraudulent nobody, and was immediately corrected by a recording of Raymond referring to me as his rightful heir. Sponsors dropped him. Business partners ghosted him. The company he'd tried to salvage folded into dust. Evelyn had attempted one last grasp at dignity, appearing in an exclusive interview on a major talk show, crying through her makeup and speaking of family and redemption and healing, but the public had grown tired. They saw through it. Her performance rang hollow against the backdrop of months of silence and venom. She faded, quietly, slipping into the fringes of relevance like fog at dawn. And me? I stayed. Because it was mine now. Not just the estate, not just the money, not just the rights to the family name, the history, the legacy, the truth. Every room I passed through, every page I turned in Raymond's journals, every rustle of wind against the garden roses he once tended, it all whispered the same thing. You're not an imposter. You were the only one who stayed, the only one who earned it. I didn't hold on to bitterness. Not anymore. Vengeance has an expiration date, and mine had passed. I didn't need to rub salt into wounds that had already split wide. Their downfall had been written not by my hand, but by theirs. I had only revealed what they tried to bury. And still, there remained one last truth. It came quietly, on a dull morning, with clouds gathering over the east field and the garden soaked in dew. Mr. Howarth returned, suit as pristine as ever, but his face carried the weight of something new. Not defeat, not worry, something heavier. Finality. "There's one more item," he said, after sitting down across from me in Raymond's study. "Locked instruction, a final provision, with release set 3 months after his passing." I nodded. "Show me." He slid a manila envelope across the desk. It was heavy, not with documents, but meaning. The handwriting was unmistakable. Raymond's, slanted and deliberate. Inside was a letter. Not legal, not financial. Personal. It began the way only he would have begun it. "Morgan, if you're reading this, then the others have already done what I predicted. They've betrayed the memory of this family in their pursuit of control. I knew they would. That's why I did what I did. But you stayed. You reminded me what family was supposed to mean. And because of that, I need you to do one more thing." He asked me to burn the original will, the one he'd made 15 years before. The one that left everything to Clara, Evelyn, and Peter in neat, equal thirds. It was obsolete now, of course, voided by the revised one we had all seen. But to Raymond, it still existed in symbol. It still hung over the house like a ghost in waiting. He had hidden it inside the old writing desk in the east corridor, behind a false bottom drawer he built with his own hands. He described it in detail, down to the measurements. It had to be destroyed, not just discarded. Burned. Not just to ensure its legal irrelevance, but to release the house from its past. So I did. That night, I retrieved the document, faded ink, brittle edges, signatures that once felt eternal. I took it to the fireplace in Raymond's study, opened the grate, and lit a single match. The flame caught quickly, eating the past like it had been starving. I watched until every line, every clause, every lie disguised as fairness turned to ash. Clara watched from the doorway. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She knew what it meant. That whatever lingering hope she had, that some technicality, some hidden clause, some final miracle might reverse the tide, was now gone. Her father's legacy no longer belonged to her image of it. It belonged to the truth. To me. After the flames died down, she turned and walked away. I never saw her again after that. She left the next morning. No goodbye. No final blow. Just silence. The estate changed after that. Not in grand, sweeping gestures, but in subtle, human ways. The portraits were reframed, some taken down, others replaced with photographs Raymond had kept in drawers, ones that showed joy instead of status. The rose garden flourished. A new wing was added to house an open library, filled with his books and letters. I began hosting lectures, scholarship programs, inviting in people Raymond would have approved of. Quiet minds, bright souls, those who carried more heart than pedigree. The Dunbridge Foundation underwent a transformation. I renamed it after Samuel, the Thorne Dunbridge Fund, for those overlooked, forgotten, orphaned by fate or family. It was my way of ensuring no child like me would ever be made to feel like a secret again. I took the name not out of ego, but because I had earned it. Morgan Thorne Dunbridge. I was no longer the outsider. I was the legacy, not crafted by blood, but carved by loyalty, by love, by truth. And when I walked the halls now, I did not walk as a guest. I walked as the heir. And no one could erase that, not anymore.